Welcome to a Hospice Chaplain's Reflections on Grief and Loss. I'm Gary Sturgis, grief specialist and the author of Surviving Grief 365 Days a Year. Today, I'm really honored to be talking with the Reverend Dr. Rosemary MacKay. Rosemary has quite an impressive resume in the field of grief and loss. Ordained in the United Church of Christ, Rosemary has worked in healthcare as a chaplain spiritual care counselor for over 40 years, working extensively with death and dying, grief, and bereavement. She has a bachelor's degree in social work, a master's of divinity in pastoral counseling, and a doctor of ministry in pastoral care. As a spiritual care provider in the hospital and hospital settings, Rosemary has addressed the spiritual needs of patients with life-limiting illnesses and provided bereavement services for patients and their families. Rosemary has always dedicated her time to those who are grieving. She's currently facilitating a weekly widowed support group where she provides support and encouragement to those suffering a significant loss. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity, Gary.
Thanks. I want to start out by letting you know I lost my spouse to stage 4 metastatic melanoma, which is quite frankly a fancy term for a really bad cancer. And when that happened, I have to be honest with you, I really didn't know very much about hospice, but I have to say that our experience with them and being on service with them was really a positive one. So I thought I would start off by asking you, for those of my viewers that also may not be familiar with hospice, what does a hospice chaplain do?
A hospice chaplain provides for the spiritual care, questions or concerns a patient and family might have during end of life. This could be a whole range of types of questions that are on their mind, like, how do I get ready to die? How's my family going to survive without me? Has my life been good enough? What are the things I'm proud of? What are my regrets? Am I good enough to make it to heaven? These are the types of spiritual questions that people might have that would be talked about.
So tell me, what inspired you to pursue a career as a hospice chaplain?
I really didn't know about chaplaincy as a career. My undergraduate degree is in social work and religious studies. My faith has always been important to me. I have 16 years of education from Catholic schools. And so I did social work for a year after I graduated from college, and then I applied to a school to study theology. And so I applied and got in because I was going to work on a Master's of Divinity degree, only to find myself in a Protestant seminary. And so it is there that I was introduced to chaplaincy. Part of the training for a Master's of Divinity program is a unit of clinical pastoral education, which is 400 hours, supervised hours of working as a chaplain in a hospital. So it was there that I found it and experienced, what I was called to do. And after more training in chaplaincy, I've been doing it for 40 years.
So being a hospice chaplain, does it require you to also be a social worker?
No, that's just, I knew I wanted to help people, and that's sort of was my segue in. And I also knew doing social work, which was, very important work, there's no question, didn't really address the spiritual side of people, which is something that is important to me.
So I'm assuming it's a tough job. And so how do you deal with the emotional aspect of it?
Sure, it can be emotional, but I have to say, one of the things I've trained ministry students through the years in my work, that often what I've said to people is, we minister out of a sense of fullness, my cup runneth over type thing. And as soon as our cup seems empty, it's our responsibility to stop and take a break to refill it. Because when you minister out of your emptiness, you're really ministering out of your own neediness, which is not going to be helpful and actually could also be dangerous for someone. So knowing yourself, knowing what your limits are and how you take care of yourself is a very important part of doing this type of ministry.
I imagine, yes. So it must be difficult to have the conversations you have with someone that's dying. How do you approach the topic of death and dying with someone, especially if they may not know they're actually at the end of life?
So, the key to any of this work, no matter what the setting is in, is to be able to be present to the person where the person is. Now, if a patient is on hospice, they have some idea that they're dying. That doesn't mean they want to talk about it, but they have some idea because they know what hospice is. And so the goal in hospice is a really tricky balance. We need to support, we need to educate and prepare people for end of life, and we need to be supportive of where they are. And hopefully the two sort of come together by the end so that you can be the most helpful with them during a very, very difficult time, as you well know, Gary. And so it really is being present to where the person is and asking questions and supporting them, educating them, being empathetic. It's not being judgmental. It's not trying to just go in with my own agenda. I know I want to, get a person to a place of being ready to die, but it's their internal process. It's not something I'm going to make happen. What I can do is encourage and ask questions. And my experience has been most people are very happy to have the opportunity to sort through whatever it is they need to sort through. And for those people who don't want to go there, don't. So it's very simple. You're not going to push that if that's not something that they want to do.
That's true, yes. So what if a person isn't spiritual or religious? How do you approach that?
So sort of as I said, the goal is to listen, to be present, to support, to educate, to be empathic. And so that's how you would approach everyone. It isn't necessarily religious. It'll become very clear if a person is religious that that's an important part of who they are. So of course you would include that. But if a person is not religious, then that doesn't come up at all. The reality is everyone is spiritual. They may not know it. They may not call it that, but that is the case. So when I worked on my doctorate, I did some research on spiritual care. And what I found interesting, and I think has borne out in the experience that I've had in the work that I've done, is that 9 out of 10 people in the United States believe in God, a higher power, divinity, whatever term you want to use. 9 out of 10 people believe it. But only 30 to 35% actually belong to a faith community, a church, a mosque, a temple, only 30 to 35%. So that's a large range between those who believe in a divinity, God, higher power, whatever term you want to use, and those who are actually involved in a faith community. And so you speak to people about what's meaningful to them. I have a quick story of a patient that we had. I had worked with her brother, who was a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. She came on to our service, so I visited her, and she said, I don't have faith like my brother, and I don't believe like my brother. And I said, that's okay, whatever. And so she was really questioning about her spirituality. Now, what's so striking about this woman is she was an artist. She had beautiful artwork around her home. She had exquisite gardens. And she and her sister started a school for grade school kids so that they made sure art was part of the curriculum. And I said, look at the beauty around you. Look at the service you've provided. That's your spiritual self. You're surrounded by it. And it was wonderful because you could see the great sense of relief come over her face because she was thinking more in terms of traditional terms. And so everyone has a spiritual side. They may not know it or know how to express it. That's kind of what you work with people about.
Yeah. So I know for myself, when my loved one was on hospice, it's tough when everyone's kind of coming in and taking care of the patient, and yet the family is also going through a traumatic experience. So I assume the aspect of grief that you deal with quite often is anticipatory grief for those people. How do you support the family, friends, and caregivers during that difficult time?
So hospice is for both the patient and the family, and the caregivers. So the goal is to support all the various parts. And what's interesting is, the caregivers, the patient, the family might not all be in the same place at the same time. So it can be a tricky balance there as well. So yes, anticipatory grief is certainly an aspect of the care that you provide. Most people worry, question, are afraid of, how am I going to manage in my world without my loved one? I mean, sure, that's a part of it. But really, when a person is on hospice, they have experienced many losses along the way. They're, when they were first told about whatever devastating diagnosis their loved one had, there's a loss associated with that. When they're told that the treatment doesn't work anymore, there's a loss associated with that. When the person, because of where they are in the dying process, are so, caught up with what's going on with them, they are no longer present to their spouse and loved ones anymore. So there's a loss in that. There's a loss when the person can't communicate anymore. There's a loss when the person is no longer themselves. So there are many, many losses along the way that people experience during the dying process.
So how do you address all the questions people have about suffering and the meaning of life? I'm assuming you get asked that a lot.
So suffering is real. There's no question about that, and difficult for the person, and also difficult, when you're working with them. I learned early on that suffering is always in the eye of the beholder. So we had this hospice patient, and I went in, and he certainly seemed very comfortable in his bed. He wasn't struggling for breathing. He wasn't in pain. And his wife said to me, I'm so, it's so hard to see him suffering. And I was a little bit taken aback, and I said, so how do you see him suffering? And she said, oh, you should have seen the vibrant man he once was. And now look at him. And so what I realized was she was suffering. She was suffering from the change that her husband had gone through, understandably. And so it's a matter of being present. It's a matter of listening. It's a matter of supporting. And it's also a matter of helping people find their inner resources to cope. Not my resources, but what works for them. And so it's talking about those things.
So what do you think are the most important things to keep in mind when working with people that are grieving?
Okay, here's my list. So the grieving process, and your viewers already know this, but this is what I think is most important, is extremely painful, overwhelming, all-consuming, and takes time. And I think supporting people in that is critically important. The next piece to that is we live in a society that doesn't understand or value any of what I just said about what the grieving process is. Instead, when we see someone upset, we rush and get them a Kleenex and say, they're there now, because we want them to stop crying because it's uncomfortable for us. Well, it isn't just the individuals in your life, it's our whole society who takes that attitude. After a year goes by, they think, okay, you're ready. You can move on with your life. No, that's not how grieving works. Grieving is its own process. It's unique, as each individual is. It's been described as it's like our own individual fingerprints. The next thing I would say about grief that I think is important is that you have to express. The only way to get through grieving is through the grieving process, is through expressing your feelings. And again, we live in a society, we feel bad, we talk ourselves out of feeling bad and try to be up. That works in some occasions, and yes, we need to do that. But to really do the grieving process, you need to feel the feelings and express them. You need to get them out. If not, they just sit like this big weight on your shoulders and then come out at the most inopportune times. I recommend to people that they cry every day. And so I suggest you cry while you're in the shower. You're getting wet anyways. It needs to be expressed. It needs to be let out. It isn't just acknowledging in your mind, ooh, I'm having a hard day today. It means sitting and feeling the feelings.
I found crying in the car was a good place to cry when I was alone in the car.
Well, you are alone, so that's good. Being a little bleary eyed, I'm not sure about driving, but yes, I can understand where that's a safe place.
So can you tell me about your experiences facilitating grief support groups or counseling people after a loss? What has that been like for you?
So I've done a few support groups through the years. And at one time I was running a living with cancer support group and a young widows and widowers support group. And I had a gentleman from the widowed support group say to me, how can you stand all these crying widows and widowers all the time? And I said to him, it's the one group of people I work with who get better. And so I think that's the thing about working with loss and grief. Grief is really meant to be a transitional phase, a transition time. It's hard work. It's overwhelming, like I said, but you can work your way through grief and see the other side of that. Another important piece about grief that I mentioned earlier is that I think there's somewhere along the process where the person comes to the realization that their life is worth continuing living, even without their beloved. And that's a really key moment, because it's not that they're going to forget their loved one, of course not, but that their life is worth continuing living. And so they can look forward to other things in their life. And I think that's an important part of the process too. And like I said, I do think grief is a transitional experience, and that people do get better.
I love that. I love when you said that grief was the one thing you worked with where people get better, because that is true, and I think people find it so hard to believe that. I know people that I work with find that hard to believe, but there's so many platitudes about, time heals all and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of people don't want to hear it, but I know what you're saying, because I feel the same way about grief, and with the people that I coach as well. I tell them all the time, it's one of those things you can't go, you have to go through it. You can't go around it. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. It's just something that you have to process and get through. And I don't think that you heal until you actually do that. As difficult as that is, it is the way through it. So I agree with you on that. So you must work with so many people of different ages, cultures.
So hang on, I just want to make another comment on that point.
Sure.
So the only way to get through the grieving process is to grieve, to feel the feelings, to get them expressed. And again, we live in a society, we live even with our family, where the last thing people want to see us doing is crying. I mean, and grief can be expressed in other ways too. It's not just tears. Tears are pretty much the most obvious. But, people can get angry. If you find yourself, I had a support group once, and a guy said, after my wife died, I bought a punching bag. And he said, I didn't realize it was because I was so angry and I needed to get it worked out. Exercise can be a way, cleaning the house, yard work, all can be ways to get that grief expressed. But it's got to be intentional. You've got to feel the feelings and get it expressed. And I had another thought that came. It has gone, but I'm sure it'll come again.
I think that people find it really difficult when they're angry, but don't you think that anger is actually a necessary emotion when it comes to grief?
I think it is. And again, it's one of those emotions we don't do that well within our society, and especially lately. It seems like, if I'm so angry, I can go attack someone, which of course is never good. the key about anger is you need to express your anger. You can't hold it in, but you need to do it in a way that's not harmful to you or harmful to someone else. That's why I say I think the punching bag is a great idea. Exercise, cleaning the house, yard work, whatever. Oh, the point that I wanted to get to. So I ran a widowed support group years ago, and a woman came to the group, and she had been widowed 8 years. And she said, what I have learned is I never grieved. I am now grieving 8 years in.
I always say it catches up with you, right?
Well, there are some people who never grieve, but they're miserable. So unless you do the work, you're not going to get out of that miserable place.
Right. So what I was going to ask you is, you must work with so many people of different ages, cultures, types of losses. How does that affect how you counsel them? I mean, is it different, or, do you use the same kind of approach, or?
So mostly I use the same approach. So it's listening, it's being supportive, it's being empathic, it's helping people identify their inner resources to cope. And you can tell in your conversation with them, what they're comfortable exploring or not. So that, influences what you ask or how you ask it or where you go in the conversation. And you just have to be present to where the person is. It's their agenda. It's not your agenda. I mean, I'm hoping that people will heal, but there's a long road to healing, and people take many, many different paths, and it's really up to them how they choose to go. And it's being present to where they are. I think holding people up and encouraging them and affirming what they've done well helps along that process. And another point I wanted to make from earlier, you asked about, how difficult it is, or over, emotionally trying. One of the things I learned early on, and I've used to work with my students, is you hold the space of people's pain and struggle. You don't take it on to be a burden to yourself. You just hold it, and you just, with reverence, because it's the other person's pain.
Good point. Yeah. So if you were to give someone grieving only one important piece of advice, what would that be?
You have to feel the feelings. You have to express the emotions. I always encourage people to keep a journal. The reason I encourage the journal is because while you're writing, you're often crying, because whether you write to your loved one who's gone, or just write about your activities of the day, or you write about how you feel, you're often crying. So that's one expressing of your emotions. But in writing it out, that's a second way that you're expressing your emotions. And that's vitally important to do. The only way to get through the grieving process is to grieve.
I was recently interviewed by someone for a local television station, and the last question she asked me was what I just asked you. She said, as a grief specialist, what would be one piece of advice that you would give someone grieving? And my answer to that was to get help, because I grieving's tough, and grieving's hard, and grieving's messy. And I think, sometimes you just can't do it alone. And that's why I think it's important for people to seek out, whether it's a therapist or a counselor or a grief support group, get help. And I think if you need, I hope my viewers know that there's help out there. And so I wanted to ask you, if you lost a loved one and you never used hospice, or you were never on service with a hospice, are you able to just call, your local hospice to get some resources for bereavement support after the loss of your loved one?
Yes, all hospices, when they provide bereavement services, when they provide support groups, provide them for anyone in the community. Another place that you can probably find out about that support is, the councils on agings would often have support groups. And also, if, check with your primary care physician, if you're struggling. So the thing is, support groups are not for everyone, and that's okay. What's powerful about a support group is that you're with other people who get it. You know, that's the number one challenging thing in our society is they don't understand the grieving process. And so you don't have to explain. You can be sad. You can just say, I just feel miserable, every little thing, you know, whatever. People get it because they're experiencing the same thing. And so that's why support groups can be so powerful. But I respect that they're not for everyone. Reading is good, but the challenge is you're understanding it in your head, but your heart isn't necessarily doing the work that it needs to do. And I'll quote Gary on this one, that the grieving process is when your heart catches up to where your head is and what you understand about grief. Therapist is good. And I'd also like to make this little comment about grief. I've had many people ask me, so what's the worst grief? You know, having a sudden death or having your loved one die after, you know, a prolonged illness. Or they'll ask, what's the worst death? Death of a spouse or the death of a child? And my answer to all of those situations is my loss is the worst loss.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And that's such a common, you know, I always say comparing losses is a losing game, because I hear people doing it a lot, you know, people that will say, you know, I lost a child, that's worse than losing a spouse or a partner. And I always say, you know, we all have a unique relationship with the person that died. So, you know, if someone is, you know, maybe someone's married, never had any children, so that's their person, that's their go-to person. And, you know, losing that person for them personally is just as deep and painful as someone maybe losing a child that has only one child. You know, it's just so unique to the relationship that you have with that person. And I truly believe that.
And also on this topic, I'll bring up pets, not the same as a person, but I believe that any person, pet, who's been a part of your daily life, that's a huge loss. Even a pet, because they're a part of your daily life. You know, and an uncle from long ago may not, you know, granted it's a family member and you may love them, and I don't, you know, you'll grieve, but especially when someone's a part of your daily life, that's a huge, huge loss.
It's true. It's true. So my last question for you is a tough one. And the reason I'm asking you this question is, as a grief coach, I'm often asked what the difference is between a grief counselor and a grief coach. And I always say that a grief counselor kind of deals with the why of the problem, and a coach deals with the how of the problem. So a counselor, you know, is someone you go to if you're stuck someplace in your grief, or you suffered trauma in your grief. I see a coach as more as a wellness profession. A coach is someone that can help you, you know, move forward after you've experienced everything from your loss. So my question for you is, how do you feel someone can make their life feel meaningful again after a significant loss?
Well, you know, these are the spiritual questions, you know, how one's life is meaningful. How do you give and receive love? What is your sense of hope? Those are all get into the realm of the spiritual. And so I think whether it's a grief coach or a grief counselor, the goal is to get to go through the grieving process, to feel the feelings, to express them, to get to a point where you can embrace that, yes, my life is worth going on with, worth living, which is an internal process. Nobody can do that for you. That's something that's inside each individual. And then, you know, pursue what's meaningful for you. I know for me, what I would say that is, you know, what fills my day? Is there love and care and support? Are you focused on helping others? Do you have fun? Those are all things that I would define as meaningful. Your sense of meaning might be something different. The key is to find out what's meaningful for you.
And so many people I work with, the biggest question they ask me is, how do I find my purpose now? You know, what is my purpose now? How would you answer that when someone asked you that?
So, I think maybe this addresses the part of the counseling part. Um, I often will, ask about the person's life and so forth. And sometimes you'll find that, not to be sexist, but many women, not so much young women today, but certainly, you know, my generation and earlier, um, they were in high school, they married their spouse, they raised their kids, you know, now their kids are grown, the spouse dies, and they don't even know who they are because they were always there for someone else. That was just, sort of part of the way our society has run. And so the key is helping people find out who they are, even if they're 75 years old. Who are they? What's important to you? What do you enjoy? I'll have people, in their 80s say, well, I feel like I should volunteer or do something to help people. And it's like, yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing. But another thing I'll say to them is, what makes your heart sing? What makes you feel good? So, people will start writing letters, and unfortunately that's going to be a lost art, or is pretty much a lost art. But staying in touch with people that way, rather than going to the library and volunteering, which would be exhausting, as people get older. So it's a matter of finding out what's meaningful and what's realistic given what's going on in the person's life.
That's true. That's true. Well, Rosemary, thank you so much. I'm sure by hearing what you've shared with us today, it will help my viewers in their own personal grief journey.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity, and don't hesitate to call.
So if you know someone who's interested in the spiritual aspect of hospice or grieving a loss, I hope that you'll share this video with them. If you have any additional comments or questions, feel free to contact me via my website, Surviving Grief, at www.sgrief.com. And thank you for joining us. Take care of yourself. And remember what I always say, we're all just walking each other home.